All right, so this week we've got a really fascinating topic in front of us.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems like every time I turn around, there's another headline about digital currencies, and specifically these CBDCs,
Mm.
central bank digital currencies.
Yeah. And it really seems like we might be on the verge of a pretty big shift in how we think about and use money.
I mean, is this potentially as big of a change as when we first started using paper money?
I think it very well could be. You sent over a ton of research on this,
Mm.
and just the sheer amount of activity and how much this is being discussed at the highest levels.
Right.
It really feels like a pivotal moment.
And, it's interesting because when you look at the data, it does seem like the use of cash is already declining.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like one of the articles you sent mentioned that in the euro area, cash use for retail payments has fallen from like 45% a decade ago down to just 30% in 2021.
Yeah, and I think even more striking is that after the pandemic, over 40% of consumers said they were using cash even less.
Wow.
So that really shows you where things are headed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really does seem like the world is moving towards a more digital way of doing things, and central banks are taking notice because your research also highlighted that something like 90% of central banks worldwide are currently exploring CBDCs.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And a quarter of them have already moved on to pilot testing,
Oh, wow.
which is pretty significant.
So we might even see like a digital euro within the next few years,
Yeah,
right?
potentially even by 2026. And the e-rupee pilots in India are also expanding really rapidly.
Yeah, so all of this just makes me wonder what's driving this global push towards digital currencies.
Well, that's the big question we have to try to answer. Why is this happening now?
Right.
And one thing that really stands out from all this research is that the rise of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin seems to have been a big wake-up call for central banks.
That makes sense.
Suddenly you have this digital form of value that's gaining traction outside of their control.
Right.
And I think that really pushed them to start thinking seriously about their own digital currency strategies.
So, okay, let's break it down then. What exactly is a CBDC?
So at its core, a CBDC is a digital version of a country's existing currency.
Okay.
So it's issued and backed by the central bank, just like physical cash.
So like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S.?
Exactly. Or the Bank of England or the RBI in India.
Got it.
So it's basically taking the concept of money that we already have and putting it into a digital form.
But how is that different from something like Bitcoin?
That's the key distinction.
Yeah.
CBDCs are centralized,
Okay.
meaning the central bank has complete control over the issuance and management of the currency.
Whereas cryptocurrencies are decentralized.
Precisely. Bitcoin, for example, operates on a public blockchain where anyone can participate.
Right.
And the network itself is what maintains the integrity of the system.
So with Bitcoin, the trust is in the code,
Yeah, you could say that. The trust is in the math, the cryptography, the decentralized nature of the network.
but with a CBDC?
The trust is in the central bank.
Okay.
It's the same trust that we place in them to manage our physical currency.
That makes sense. So, one of the things that's really exciting about CBD fees is the potential for faster and cheaper transactions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big selling points.
Yeah, I mean, one article even mentioned that transaction fees could be as low as 0.1%.
Right, which is a huge difference compared to things like PayPal or credit card fees, which could be 3% or even more.
Yeah, but what's the trade-off here?
Well, the potential downside is that CBDCs could give governments a lot more visibility into our financial transactions.
Because everything is digital and trackable.
Exactly. Every time you spend or receive money using a CBDC, it could potentially be recorded and tracked.
And that raises some pretty big concerns about privacy.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
one of the most debated aspects of CBDCs.
Yeah, and it makes me think of that Payments Innovation podcast we listened to, where they talked about this tension between the desire for seamless transactions and the need to protect our privacy.
Yeah, that was a really insightful discussion. It's a really tough balancing act.
Okay, so let's move on to another big potential impact of CBDCs, monetary policy.
Right now, we're talking about a potential revolution in how central banks manage the economy.
Wow, how so?
Well, because with CBDCs, central banks could have a much more direct and immediate way to implement policy changes.
What do you mean?
For example, think about stimulus payments.
Okay.
Instead of having to go through banks and all these intermediaries, the central bank could just directly distribute money to people's digital wallets.
Wow, that would be fast.
Exactly.
Ah,
It could be
interesting.
almost instantaneous.
And what about interest rates?
Well, they could potentially adjust interest rates in real time
Wow.
rather than having to make these big announcements every few months. They could fine-tune things much more frequently based on real-time economic data.
That's incredible. And then there's this idea of programmable money.
Ah, yes, that's a really interesting concept.
Can you explain that one?
Sure. So with programmable money, you can basically embed specific conditions or rules into the digital currency itself.
What, like expiration dates?
Exactly. Like in China, they've experimented with digital yuan that expire after a certain period of time.
Oh, wow.
And the idea is to encourage people to spend the money and stimulate the economy.
So it's like a use it or lose it kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So it sounds like CBDCs could also give central banks a much better understanding of how the economy is actually working.
Right, because they would have access to all this real-time data on spending patterns and economic activity.
Which could lead to better forecasting and more effective policies.
Precisely. It could really enhance their ability to manage inflation and stabilize the economy.
But are there any risks we should be aware of?
Well, one concern is the potential for negative interest rates.
Oh, right.
Because in a digital currency system, it would be much easier to implement negative rates.
And that could basically be like a tax on savings.
Yeah, essentially. It could discourage people from saving and push them to spend more.
Which could be good for the economy in some ways.
Right. But could also have unintended consequences.
Okay, so let's talk about how CBDCs could impact cross-border payments.
Ah, that's another area where they could really be a game changer.
How so?
Well, right now, the system for international payments is pretty slow and expensive.
Yeah, it relies on SWIFT and all those intermediaries.
Exactly. It can take days for payments to settle, and fees can be quite high.
Yeah, sometimes as much as 4 to 7%.
Right. So imagine if you could send money across borders instantly and with minimal fees.
That would be huge, especially for things like remittances.
Exactly. It could make a huge difference for people who rely on sending money back home to their families.
Yeah, and I think we're already starting to see some progress in this area.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a project called mBridge.
Yeah, what's that?
It's a collaboration between the central banks of Hong Kong, Thailand, China, and the UAE.
Okay.
And they've actually demonstrated cross-border CBDC transfers that settle in just 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
Yeah, compared to the usual 3 to 5 days with traditional methods.
That's insane.
It's really remarkable.
And this could also have some pretty big geopolitical implications, right?
Yeah, potentially. If countries can settle trade directly in their own digital currencies, it could reduce their reliance on the US dollar.
So we could see an acceleration of de-dollarization.
That's a possibility, although how quickly and to what extent that might happen is still being debated.
Okay, so let's circle back to the issue of privacy.
Right, because that's obviously a major concern with CBDCs.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of governments being able to track every transaction is pretty unsettling for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. It raises questions about surveillance and the potential for abuse.
So what are some of the ways they're trying to address these concerns?
Well, one idea that's been floated is tiered privacy.
Okay, what's that?
So basically, different levels of anonymity would be applied to different types of transactions.
Okay.
So smaller everyday purchases might have a higher degree of privacy.
But larger transactions would be subject to more scrutiny.
Exactly. The thinking is that this could strike a balance between privacy and the need to prevent things like money laundering or tax evasion.
Yeah, but who decides where those thresholds are?
Right. And what about people who have legitimate reasons for wanting to keep their larger transactions private?
These are all really tough questions.
Yeah, there are no easy answers here.
Yeah.
It's going to be a complex challenge to design a system that protects privacy while also preventing misuse.
Okay, so let's think about how this could impact traditional banks.
Yeah, because if people start holding their money directly with the central bank, that could be pretty disruptive for commercial banks.
Yeah, they could lose a lot of deposits.
Exactly. And that could impact their ability to lend money and perform their other core functions.
So how are they thinking about mitigating that?
Well, most of the proposals for CBDCs involve a two-tier system.
What does that mean?
It means that the central bank would issue the digital currency to commercial banks.
Okay.
And then those banks would distribute it to individuals and businesses.
So it's kind of like how things work now with physical cash.
Yeah, it's similar in that way. The idea is to maintain the existing role of commercial banks in the system.
But even with a two-tier system, couldn't there still be competition for deposits?
Absolutely. Especially if CBDCs were to offer interest on holdings.
Because why would you keep your money in a commercial bank if you could earn the same or better interest directly from the central bank?
Exactly. That's one of the potential challenges that policymakers are going to have to grapple with.
Okay, so as we wrap up, let's come back to that initial question about the future of cash.
Right. What happens to physical money in a world of CBDCs?
It seems like we're already moving towards a more cashless society.
Yeah, the trend is definitely in that direction.
Some projections even suggest that cash could account for less than 10% of transactions in developed economies by 2026.
Yeah, and we already have examples like Sweden, where cash usage is extremely low.
But there is some pushback against a completely cashless society, right?
Oh, for sure. Some people are concerned about financial inclusion and making sure that everyone has access to basic financial services.
And I know some U.S. states have even passed laws requiring businesses to accept cash.
Right, that's to protect people who don't have bank accounts or who prefer to use cash.
So it seems like central banks are trying to position CBDCs as a complement to cash rather than a replacement.
At least for now, yeah. They're presenting it as another option, another way to make payments.
But, I wonder if something like a major economic crisis could accelerate the adoption of CBDCs.
Yeah, it's possible.
Like, what if we had a situation with really high inflation?
Well, in that kind of scenario, governments might be more tempted to use CBDCs to implement things like price controls or targeted subsidies.
Because they could do it much more quickly and efficiently than with traditional methods.
Exactly. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So it sounds like we're really talking about a fundamental shift in the nature of money here.
Yeah, it's a really profound change.
And it comes with both potential benefits and risks.
Absolutely. Increased efficiency on the one hand.
But more centralized control on the other.
It's a trade-off that we're going to have to carefully consider as we move forward.
Thinking about all this, it makes me wonder if cash might eventually become like a niche thing.
Interesting.
Like almost like vinyl records.
Ah, I see what you're
So
saying.
like it's still around and some people collect it and appreciate it,
Yeah.
but it's not the main way that people listen to music anymore.
Right, and maybe cash will become something similar. Like it'll still exist, but it won't be the primary way that we transact in our everyday lives.
Exactly.
That's a really thought-provoking analogy.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. It's a fascinating topic for sure.